So today I wanted to do a video inspired by something that Kayla from Books and Lala did. Recently she did a video where she did a scavenger hunt to find her next read, and I really enjoyed watching the process of getting these prompts and finding a book to match them. I thought that I would do the same scavenger hunt, but where Kayla has clearly read very many books and she was able to do her full scavenger hunt using her 5-star reads shelf, I decided that I would use my entire shelf, including my TBR, and I would read any books that were on my TBR as I go along. Let's get started. The first prompt is to pick a favourite book, go to the acknowledgements and then find the first name that's mentioned and find a book written by an author with the same name. Camilla Shamsi's Home Fire, this was the first book I picked up that actually had an acknowledgement in it. And the first name I came to was Alexandra. Only book that's in my collection with an author called Alexandra is Law by Alexandra Bracken. I don't know too much about this book, it's on my Kindle. Essentially what I know about it is that it's some sort of Greek myths retelling, or not necessarily retelling, but utilising the characters and the gods from Greek myths. So we'll give that a go and I will check in with you when I've read a bit more. Okay, I've had a moment now to think about how I feel about Law by Alexandra Bracken. It did take me a moment to decide whether I liked it or not. Essentially this is YA, urban fantasy, Greek myth retelling. It felt very Hunger Gamesy in that it's very much like fight to the death scenario, in which you're trying to bring honour of the kill to your, or the hunt it's called, the hunt. You're trying to bring the honour of the hunt to your bloodline, and everyone desires a thing called kleos, which is like honour in battle. So the premise of the story is that Zeus has punished all of the gods, and every 7 years, for 7 days, they become mortal. And this is called the Aegon. And during the Aegon, different bloodlines are trying to kill the gods, but the bloodlines are trying to protect their own gods. If a god is killed by one of the bloodlines, the person that killed them will ascend and take on the powers of that god. However, if the god dies from some other means, so if let's say they got hit by a car and died by accident, then that god is just wiped out of the Aegon. That it's just game over for them. The Aegon that we're following, it's taking place in New York City, and we're following Law, hence the title. We're following Law, whose family was all killed in the previous Aegon, as she navigates trying not to get sucked back into this year's one, but ultimately sort of being forced into coming back. And she is the last of her bloodline. And essentially the story takes place over the 7 days of the Aegon, but with these little flashes back in time to the previous one when she lost her family. The tropes that are included in this story are like friends to lovers, a slow burn romance, and found family, or like a ragtag team that have come together through no choice of their own. I mean, I don't think I'm that bothered about tropes in general. None of these would have made me go, oh, I really want to read this book. For me, it was the Greek myth retelling aspect that made me want to read the book. This is a very battle-orientated story. So if you're not into fight scenes or battles, then this is absolutely not going to be the story for you. I don't think I cared that much. Unfortunately, I didn't feel that invested. I didn't feel that sucked in. And I think the problem was the length of the story. So this was already over 400 pages, but it felt, for the amount of information that needed to be worked through, even in just these 7 days, that it needed to be twice the length that it was. Everything went past too fast. It was just whizzing through it, and I just think there was a lot that needed to be explored more. Different characters and their relationships to each other, different political aspect, even just the reasoning behind the Aegon in the first place. It all just felt rushed, and I feel like the author might have been constrained by some sort of arbitrary rule that they were given, that it needed to not exceed, say, 450 pages or something like that. Because yeah, it was just too rushed, and I don't think I liked it for that fact. But I do think that I could have liked it if it had been more in depth. The other issue that I think a lot of people might find trying to get into the book is that the characters are quite complex, and the reason they're complex is because there's so many layers. So first of all, we have our sort of 6-ish main characters in this ragtag team, found family thing that we're following as they work through the Aegon. Then we have, in the previous flashbacks, we've got all of their family and friends who either are dead or who have made it, but, you know, there are different things that you need to know about them. Then you've got people from the different bloodlines who are mentioned regularly. Then we have the gods. And this is another thing, is I'm not quite sure, based on the mythology that I know, I'm not sure how the gods for this Aegon were chosen, because they don't seem to be, say, the 11 gods that were around Zeus, but Zeus has punished them. Is it Zeus's children? I'm not sure how the gods were chosen for the Aegon, but we have all of those gods, and then where those gods die, we then also have people who have ascended to become a new god. So they had an original name in the bloodline, and then they have the powers of the god that they've ascended into, but then they're encouraged to choose a new name because they are a new god. They are not the other god. They just have their powers. So you have all these levels of names and characters that you have to learn. And there is, I realised at the end, a family chart, like a characters chart. But because I read this on my Kindle, I didn't see that till the very end. So it's perhaps a book that you need to read in physical form, or they need to move that to the beginning, because I didn't see any of that until the very end. And then I was like, oh, okay, well, that would have been helpful in the first few chapters. So I think a lot of people are going to be put off by, say, the first 20% of the book. Once you get past the 20% of the book, the characters start to become a bit more clear. You start to get some familiarity with them, but it's a lot. It's a lot to take on. As I said, I think this should be like an 800-page epic 7-day battle scene. That's what it should be, because you need to explore the mythology, you need to explore the politics, you need to explore the characters more and their relationships to each other, because it is just too rushed. So, prompt 2 is pick something from the cover of your first book and find that thing on another book. So Lore doesn't have very much on its cover. It is the face of a woman, Medusa, with the serpents for hair. So that was quite difficult. The one I came up was Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, because we have a face with tentacles. I thought that was quite similar to the serpents that Medusa has in her hair. I am a little bit worried about this. So I own Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, and also Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. They are two of the books that have been on my TBR the longest. So these will have been on my shelves since before 2017. I'm not sure quite when, but before 2017. I've always put off reading them, and I think I've always put off reading them because I hadn't read the book that they were based on. But this year I have actually read, or listened to anyway, Sense and Sensibility. And so I thought, okay, yeah, I'll give this one a try. This one is going to be a bit of a caveat. I'm going to give it about 10 chapters, I think. I've read the first 2 chapters so far. I think I'm going to give it 10 chapters, because if it is literally Sense and Sensibility but with some added references to these sea monsters, then I'm not really interested in reading it. If it's Sense and Sensibility but expanded, and there is an actual real narrative in this edition of the sea monsters and what's going on with the waters. And I have to say, in these first 2 chapters, there is some suggestion about what's caused the issue, what's caused this change in the seas around Britain. But yeah, I'm going to give it 10 chapters. And if it's looking like there's nothing else, there's no extra something, then I'm probably going to DNF. And if I do DNF, then I'll also unhaul Pride and Prejudice and Zombies as well. Okay, so I didn't get very far into this. I got to 50 pages, but I've decided to DNF. But it is a soft DNF, because it's not bad. But I think I've read the original Sense and Sensibility too recently, and so it feels more like I'm rereading Sense and Sensibility than that I'm reading a new book. And I'm not into it, I'm not feeling it. So I feel like this is the sort of book that I would read a year or more after having read the original. Essentially what we have is the original story by Jane Austen of Sense and Sensibility, but then Ben Winters has taken the themes and different characters' personality traits, and then he's woven them into this new sea monsters story. And it's actually quite cleverly done. And that's why I say I've soft DNFing, because I do think I want to read this. I want to see where he takes it. And from reading other people's reviews, I've seen that later on in the book, it really ramps up in terms of action, and sort of the mythology of sea monsters gets much more incorporated. But what I've seen so far is that, yeah, he's taken, like, say, a personality characteristic of somebody, and then he's exaggerated it using the sea monsters or using something to do with this new world that he's building. The example that I will give is that in the original we have Willoughby, who's a character who ultimately is very exciting for Marianne, one of our protagonists. We think they're going to get married, we think they're sort of having a romance, and then he decides to marry a woman that his aunt or grandmother has decided he should marry, because he doesn't want to risk losing his inheritance. In other words, it's all about the money. Because Marianne is poor, he wants to ensure that he still lives a comfortable life. In Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters, Willoughby is portrayed as essentially a pirate. He is even called a treasure hunter in those first few chapters that I've read. So they've really taken this characteristic of him, the fact that, yes, he's fun, yes, we could romanticize him and he's exciting, but ultimately he's self-obsessed and wants money, basically. So I thought it's quite clever how they're doing it, but yeah, I'm just not feeling it, so I've decided to DNF for now and put it down. Now, prompt 3, go to page 50, line 5, and from that line find a title with the same word. So line 5, page 50 from this is, to concern themselves with, men are very safe with us, let them be ever. That sounds really convoluted when you just say one line in isolation, but obviously didn't really want to choose words like to, are, with, because those are quite commonly in titles. So I underlined concern themselves, men, and then safe, and then looked through my shelf to see if I had any books that had those words in the title. And what I picked up was You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr. So one of the sort of categories of books that are on my shelf is if somewhere like Waterstones is having a clearance sale where books are massively reduced, I will have a look through, because often the books that are included in the sales simply aren't very well known. It's not that they're bad books, it's that they're just not very well known, or the publishing house didn't put the marketing effort in that they put into some of their other books, or that because of the nature of the story, so often it's literary fiction, doesn't get the hype on things like BookTok, BookTube, Instagram. And so I will often pick up books from there to give them a chance and to see if they're worth reading, because there can be some absolute corkers. So You Will Be Safe Here is set in South Africa, and it's a dual timeline. So the first timeline is 1901 with the Second Boer War, which I don't know very much about. I actually have already read a little bit of the book, so I'm at page 78 before I've had a moment to film. But so we're following a character called Sarah van der Walt, who is a Dutch colonialist. So essentially the Dutch came in, they colonised South Africa, enslaved black people, enslaved the people who lived there. And then the Boer War is where the English came in and tried to take over. They wanted the power, they wanted ownership essentially over the gold and diamond mines that were there. And so the character that we're following in this first part, in this first timeline, has been sent to essentially a concentration camp, but they're calling it a refugee camp. But all of these Dutch colonisers are being persecuted, and so this lady's husband has gone off to fight the Boer War, so he is fighting the British. So she is being treated even worse than some of the others who perhaps have signed something to say that they will give up their husbands or something like that. So she is going through absolute hell in this refugee camp, but she's also trying to keep her son alive, so she's got her 6-year-old son with her. The second timeline is something like 2010, so 20 something, and a mother is sending her son to like a reformation camp. I haven't got to it, so I don't know too much about it. All we've got is like the first chapter is from that timeline where the mother is dropping her son off at this camp. So we don't know anything else about it yet. So yeah, it's a topic I don't know very much about. So far, it's been utterly heartbreaking. I think as a mother, it's really difficult to read because of what's going on in this refugee camp and how the British are treating the Dutch. But obviously there's also that conflict of knowing that the Dutch have also been treating the African people, the black people, horrendously as well. Like, they've enslaved them. The interesting thing is that this first part is told through a diary, the diary of a Dutch colonizer, and therefore she feels that they are the righteous ones, they are the ones who are being maltreated. She doesn't recognise that the treatment that the Dutch people put on the black people is bad, which is an interesting dynamic to read the book from. And because it is her perspective, you're really starting to feel how awful it is, that the way that she's being treated. And then there'll be this little hint, but it's a hint that's so subtle that sort of snaps you to go, oh, actually though, but they did this to them. Like, there'll be a brief mention of, say, the Zulu War, and you'll be like, oh yeah, no, she's not as angelic as she seems. But yeah, so it's a really interesting book so far, heartbreaking. But on the front it does say, beautiful, it pulls you in, breaks your heart, and then ultimately repairs it. So I'm hoping to feel some reparation by the end of it, because it is heartbreaking. You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr is such a phenomenal book. So it's split into 4 parts. Part 1 is the diary of Sarah Vanderwatt, who was in a refugee camp in 1901 during the Second Boer War. We then move on to 1970s, and we start following one family until we culminate with Willem, who is our next sort of protagonist. And he is sent to an army camp because his stepfather, his father, his mother feel that he needs to man up. He needs to be less academic, less nerdy, they think he needs to feel the rigours of these army camps that are set up by military men. I have never read anything like this. I mean, I say that. The second half with the army camp is very like Holes. There's a lot of digging going on. So if you've ever read Holes, I love that book as well. But this one, Damien Barr did a lot of research for this book, and I loved reading the historical note and the author's note at the end, where he talks about how the section in the army camp was based on a real life case, and the mother of the boy in question invited Damien to come and interview her, so she could talk about her experiences, talk about what really happened. And so that was the basis for this last part of the book. The Boer Wars is not something I've ever really learnt about, so I had no idea about any of this. And yeah, it was a really fascinating book. Such a shame that this was in the clearance section at Waterstones, because this deserves way more hype. And that is even though it's got Book at Bedtime on BBC Radio 4, an Observer, Irish Times, and NPR Book of the Year. This should have more readership. People should be reading this. It's fantastic. It is heartbreaking. I will say, if you are a mother, this was hard to read. But I'm a mother of a 4 and a 2-year-old, and I've read it, and it was beautiful. The other thing that Damien Barr has written, I don't know if he's written anything since this. I think this was published in 2019, so I don't think he's had anything since then. But his previous book was a memoir about growing up homosexual in Thatcher's Britain. It's called Maggie and Me, and I actually really want to read that. I'm not usually a big memoir reader, but that sounds quite intriguing to me, so I'd like to read that. I gave this a 4.75 on Storygraph, but I rounded up to a 5 on Goodreads because it's definitely closer to a 5 than a 4-star. I really, really recommend this. So the next prompt was to find a 5-star read with the same colours on the cover, and so I immediately thought of On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan, because I thought they looked so similar. The red author name, the blues and blacks, quite monochromy, but with the blue, yeah, so that's where I went. I went to On Chesil Beach. So obviously being a 5-star read, that does mean I have already read it and I will not be reading it for this vlog. This was one of my favourite reads from 2021. I'd never read Ian McEwan before. I read this because it was on the English GCSE or A-level syllabus. I was a bit worried. I was wary about reading this when I first picked it up because based on the cover, based on the name, based on the description, I didn't really know what to expect. But this, as I say, was one of my top 5 books from 2021. I loved this. I've picked up quite a few more Ian McEwans. I really want to read some more of his work. If you want to know more about the content of the book, then you can check out the video. I'll link it in the description below so you can see more about that. But moving on, because I'm aware this is going to be a very long video. So the next prompt, find a book with the same number of pages. So this is 166 pages. I used my Storygraph app to work out what books I own that have 166 pages. I had one book, Dead Poets Society. So this is written by N.H. Kleinbaum, but I didn't realise when I bought this that it is a novelisation of the film. So the film is not based on the book is based on the film. But I got this a couple of years ago when I went through a bit of I wonder whether I'd like dark academia books, and then never read it. I have read this because since I last spoke to you, I mean, being 166 pages, this is a very devourable book. So I have read it for this scavenger hunt, but I have already read it since I last spoke to you. So I really struggled with what to rate this. So I read this in 2 sittings. It was very readable, very quick to devour, but I was disappointed. And the reason I was disappointed is that the story, so just to let you know, I have never seen the film. So I didn't know what the story was. No idea. But the story behind it is really good. It is fantastic. However, it's too brief. There is so much that could be gone into. And I always feel like with dark academia, there should be a lot of description. There should be a lot of exploration of the societies, the politics, the characters, the relationships. Dark academia, to me, is a more descriptive storytelling method. It's not like a thriller. It's not rushed. You really need that deep exploration, whereas this is too brief to do that. The things that happen in it, so there are some sad bits, happen too quickly to really make you feel anything. I'm sure in the film you perhaps do feel that more, but with the book it was just too rushed. What I really hope is one day someone is going to rewrite this but put in the level of detail that needs to go into it, because this could very much be a 5-star read. But this version is not. Absolutely not. And the other thing that needs to change is there is a section that has not aged well, and that is the romance between Chris and Knox. It is not okay for a man to touch a woman without her knowledge or consent. And it is not okay. I really don't think you should be representing a romance where the man has pursued the woman despite her saying she doesn't want to be pursued, and despite her saying that she's not interested, and then for that romance to actually come about. Like, I don't think that should be a thing. Like, he essentially humiliates her in front of her peers, her whole class, her teacher, and yet she still gives him a chance, and I just didn't really... I felt a bit uncomfortable about that. So I gave it a 3 because it has potential. Yeah, it has potential, but it was not it. So the next prompt was to open on any page, and the first name that you come across to find an author with that name. Dead Poets Society, because it's a boys' school, a private school, they often refer to each other by their surnames. And so the first name I came to was Watson. The only book I have on my shelves is Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. This is a Persephone Editions, and this is a very fun read. It is somewhat of a Cinderella retelling. We have Miss Pettigrew, she's a governess, but she's been sent for a new job. It's sort of her last chance to really keep employment. She's very worried, she's quite downtrodden, but she goes to this very wealthy sort of society lady's house thinking that she's going to be a governess. when what this lady actually wanted was sort of a housekeeper. Situation after situation arises, and Miss Pettigrew becomes more of a friend to this lady. It being a Cinderella story, it's like a rags to riches story. But it's so light-hearted, it's so much fun. This edition has some gorgeous... I'm not going to be able to find any now. We have some gorgeous little illustrations as well that make it feel like it's come out of a newspaper or something. And you know, the writing is not difficult. So this is a lovely quick read. And it's basically told over the course of a day. So each of the chapters is a timestamp. And yeah, it's a quick read, it's a fun read, it's lovely, so I do highly recommend this. The next prompt was really difficult. So it is to find another title with the same number of letters. So this one has 25 letters, so that's really... I really struggled, I had to go through so many books, but I came up with The Restoration of Otto Laird by Nigel Packer. So I've got my bookmark in it, but I haven't actually started, that's just... highlighting chapter 1. So this is where we've gotten up to. Otto Laird. Otto Laird is outraged. The peaceful, if slightly bemused existence of this elderly retired architect is rudely interrupted when he learns that his most revolutionary and controversial building, Marlow House, a 1960s local authority tower block in South London, is to be demolished. Determined to do everything in his power to save the building, Otto returns to London for the first time in 25 years. As he explores his past, ponders his present, and considers the future for himself and his building, he embarks on a most remarkable journey, one that will change everything Otto ever thought he knew about himself and those closest to him. It sounds good. It reminds me of the sorts of description a man called Uwe. I've read The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window, and it sort of gives me those sorts of vibes. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where this one goes. I finished The Restoration of Otto Laird by Nigel Packer. This is a 5-star read. This was brilliant. So Otto is like a nearly 80-year-old man who was an architect in his career. So this book is very character driven. It is not plot based. There is a story going on in the background that really drives the narrative, that drives the reflections that Otto is having about his life, but this is really all about his life up to this point. And I'm really surprised because I wouldn't have said that I liked books that pretty much had no plot. Like this, I'd have thought that a character-driven book wouldn't have been my cup of tea, but this was so brilliant. The book that it reminds me of, the only book I've read that I would say is similar, Eleanor Oliphant, is completely fine. Even though I feel like Eleanor Oliphant has more of a plot than this. I think this one is really about the whole life of this man, but you really feel like you get to know him. You find out so much about his history, and each section of his life is so interesting. Whereas Eleanor Oliphant is really about sort of the time period in which it's set. Like, it's not necessarily flitting, at least from what I remember. Might be wrong. I had never heard this mentioned. This is one of those books that I picked up simply because it was in the Waterstones clearance sale. So I think I spent £2 on this book, but it is so underrated. It hasn't got very high ratings on like Goodreads or Storygraph, but I think that's probably because it's a character-based story rather than a plot-based one. I loved the way that it brought together the idea of architecture being an art form, architecture being a form of politics and of fighting against political structures. I was really surprised, but I did actually, I didn't know whether to annotate it because I didn't know if I'd love it the whole way through, but I have done little post-it notes because there were so many sections that I loved. The first chapter is quite shocking. We open on, it was not uncommon these days for Annika Laird to return from one of her morning trips to town to find her husband standing naked in the kitchen window. That is the first sentence. And then within, is it the first chapter? Okay, so in chapter 2, we have a scene in which Otto and Annika are making love. So he's like a 79-year-old man, but it is not overtly sexual. It is very much looking at the lived experience of someone of that age. He's undergone major surgery. He can no longer perform in the bedroom in that way. and it's looking at how they are still intimate with each other, and it's actually quite beautiful. Like, it's weird as a young person to think about an old person having those sorts of relations, but it was quite interesting and quite beautiful. There's also a section in the front, so as you can see I've got like post-it notes everywhere, but there is also a section in which, with that first sentence where he is looking out of the window completely naked, is because he's always looking at this wall, and it's a wall that is a remnant from when they bought the land, demolished the house that was there, and built their own house. And that wall becomes quite symbolic throughout the story. This idea of knocking down buildings to replace it with something that you think is better or more important, and how future generations may not see it that way. And yeah, there's just so much symbology, whatever the word is. It's just a really lovely book. So yeah, 5 stars from me. The next prompt in the scavenger hunt is to find a cover that is similar to this one. I don't own any. I literally have trawled my shelves. Like, I could have gone with colour maybe to look similar. I mean, that just didn't feel quite right. There is nothing on my shelves that really looks like this. There is a little man, and I have a book that has a very similar man. And so that is the you see, very similar little silhouetted men. But if you put them next to each other like this, you'd think I was completely mad. But that's the way I've gone with these little men. And so this is The Testament of Gideon Mack by James Robertson. Never heard of it, but it was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2006. So clearly well liked, I suppose. I have just started, so I'm just a tiny bit in. But this is, so for Gideon Mack, faithless minister, unfaithful husband, and troubled soul, the existence of God, let alone the devil, is no more credible than that of ghosts or fairies, until the day he falls into a gorge and is rescued by someone who might just be Satan himself. Mack's Testament, a compelling blend of memoir, legend, history, and quite probably madness, recounts one man's emotional crisis, disappearance, resurrection, and death. It also transports you into an utterly mesmerising exploration of the very nature of belief. That sounds really up my street. So this is a book that I purchased from a charity shop, so it's a bit battered, but I have to say I was drawn in by the name, The Testament of Gideon Mack, and then that blurb, that just sounds right up my street. I would say, I feel like they sound quite similar. I feel like they sound more like they're character driven, so whilst this does sound like it has an interesting plot, the fact that this man believes that he's met the devil, I do think it's going to be more character based, and so I do think they're going to actually be in themes quite similar. Ooh, finished The Testament of Gideon Mack by James Robertson. I think that it's a shame that I read this after reading The Restoration of Otto Laird, and also that I read it after reading Trust by Hernan Diaz. The Testament of Gideon Mack is kind of split up into 3, and it's this idea of a book within a book. So we start with our prologue, which is somewhat of an introduction by the person who is publishing this testament that Gideon Mack has written. Prologue is 21 pages. It's quite long. It's very dry. The publisher is clearly, the author, James Robertson, is trying to make the publisher sound like he is not an author. He is just trying to convey the facts. And he is conveying in that bit the bits that were published in newspapers, the facts that are sort of generally known about this, as an introduction to what Gideon Mack has written, his memoir, his testament. The bulk of the book is the actual bit that Gideon Mack has supposedly written. And then the end is the person who came across the manuscript going to the town, Monimasket, where it's all set, and interviewing the people who are mentioned in the testament, basically to try and get a better picture of who Gideon Mack was, whether his testament can be trusted, and this is where Trust by Hernan Diaz comes in, sort of asking them whether what he's written is true. Obviously at this point they haven't read what Gideon Mack has written, but he sort of probes and he gives away enough information to try and see what the truth is. It's very similar to The Restoration of Otto Laird in that it is essentially like a memoir of Gideon Mack. In The Restoration of Otto Laird, it all sort of is prompted, and the whole story is pushed along by the fact that this building is going to be demolished. And that is what prompts all of Otto Laird's reflections on his life. In the Testament of Gideon Mack, it's about this standing stone that appears out of nowhere. So it's never been there before. Obviously, if you know anything about standing stones, they are ancient, prehistoric monuments, basically, that don't just appear out of nowhere. And so that is the catalyst for Gideon Mack's reflections. And then a subsequent accident that happens where he falls into this thing, what's it called? The gorge, but it's called Black Jaws because it's, this sort of ravine with rushing water and, basically you don't fall into it and survive, essentially. But Gideon Mack apparently does. And he does because the devil saved him, and he spent 3 days with the devil in a cave that's in this gorge before being released back and floating out the other side. And so obviously it is somewhat fantastical because these things happen in it that can't be explained. And that's where I think trust comes into it. Trust by Hernan Diaz is that, can we trust what Gideon Mack is saying? If he is having some sort of delusions about what happened to him, if it was a head injury that caused it, if it's all because Gideon Mack is a priest and he's having issues with whether he believes in God, if all of this, very noisy plane, if all of this is prompted by something mental, then we can't really trust what Gideon Mack is saying. It might all be in his head. But we have this actual event that's happening, and then the event causing Gideon Mack to look back on his upbringing. He was raised in a very religious household, how he came to meet his wife and his best friend, and then how those really bloody noisy planes, and then how he sort of had feelings for his best friend's wife. So we're going through all of this story, building up to the point where he meets the devil, and then the bit where he meets the devil is sort of at the end of his account. It sort of wraps it up for him before we move on to the interview with the other people. Unfortunately, it just didn't stand up next to this as a reflective, character-driven storyline. I can see what the author was trying to do here. They were probing ideas of belief. I have written some notes. What are the questions that I found arising from this? Why did Gideon only partially tell the truth about Elsie? So Elsie is the wife of his best friend, the one he has feelings for. It is like the one bit in this book, really noisy planes. It is the one bit in this book that seems to be proven to be not true or partially not true. And therefore, what else in his testament was a lie? What was going on with the divinity school grant? So near the beginning, we find out that when Gideon decides he wants to attend the divinity school, the divinity course, to become a priest, there is some very specific clauses in this grant that he becomes eligible for that make it sound completely fantastical. For instance, you have to be the son of a priest, which he is. You have to have lived in Scotland, which he does. You have to have met all these criteria, and then finally you get a bit more money if you have the same initials as the founder, which is GM, just like Gideon Mack, and so he gets the extra money. Just seems a bit too good to be true. But anyway, what's the connection between Che, Catherine and Gideon? So Catherine is an agnostic who is in the parish that Gideon works in, who he becomes very good friends with. They have these really thought-provoking discussions and debates, and he goes to visit her every week. Che is the gentleman who ultimately drags him out of the river once he's been released by the devil. Whether it's the devil or not, we don't know. But once he's released back, it's Che that finds him on the other side and sort of takes him to hospital where he recovers. Che is also linked to Catherine in some way. And then there is this art installation that happens that also seems to have a real connection that also slightly connects these three people. And then what was the devil? Was he real or imagined? Potentially was he real but not who Gideon thought he was? Why was he in the cave? Is he some sort of manifestation of something? So there are questions arising. And I do love a book that brings up questions and makes you think. What do I wish, though, about this book? That the character statements at the end were more interesting. So other than where we sort of start to realise that what was said about Elsie isn't the real truth. I'm not going to divulge what, but it wasn't quite the truth of the matter. The rest of them are really boring. Like, they literally, to me, don't add anything other than to confirm that potentially Gideon was telling the truth in what he said, to a certain point, as far as other people in the community could have gathered. But it was just really like a boring way of doing it. I don't know. I wish that we explored the father more. So that relationship was really interesting. Whether it's the history of the father and how the father grew up, because there's something about what happened to the father that made him who he was. Yes, I know they do touch on it. So we know these things, but it's not developed. It's not explored at all. But that would have been much more interesting, because certain things happen between them and in their own lives that just could have been better explored. Considering the length of this book and how long it took me to read, I don't really feel like anything that I was actually interested in got explored. I felt like other areas were explored. And then the interaction with the devil, considering that's quite a draw to the book, on the blurb it's one of the main things that's mentioned, that isn't really explored. Those 3 days that he spends with him are only a very small section of the book. Yes, I know it's supposed to be reflective on his whole life, but that's one of the really interesting bits. That's the bit where he really starts to explore belief and what's going on in the wider world and whether we can trust things and where is God and this, that and the other. And yeah, so that bit was just too rushed for me. There was a really good quote in it that I liked, that I've written down, that becomes quite ironic, and I'll explain that in a minute. So the quote is, "When I think of all the novels I've read, I do wonder if it's been a sensible use of my time. Why would I fill my head with all those made-up stories if it wasn't to try to understand my own story? Every month my book group discusses a novel and its characters as if they were real people making real-life choices. Life is a story. Maybe that's why everyone thinks they have a novel in them. It's a refuge from confusion. If they can just tell a story where all the loose ends tie up, the world will make a lot more sense." But then that's actually quite ironic, because in this story, nothing makes sense. No loose ends are tied up. It's all left very open-ended. So whilst I do think this is probably a very good book, and I've looked at other reviews and people absolutely rave about it. Oh, for crying out loud, with those planes. So I do think this is a really good book, but unfortunately, if you like this sort of reflective nature, I would be more likely to recommend The Restoration of Otto Laird. That was done much better from that perspective. And if you like this idea of exploring belief and whether we can trust what people write about themselves, about memoirs and books within books, then I would recommend Trust by Hernan Diaz. That was phenomenal. So let's move on to the final prompt, because we are on the final book. So the final prompt is to open a page at random and point at any word on the page and then find a book with that word in the title. The word that I came across was silence. And so we have our final book, which is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which is also going to be part of another reading vlog, because when I realised I was going to be reading this and Ghost Wall, which are both on the 2018 or 2019 Women's Prize list, I thought, let's group those two together. So this one is a library copy, but I have it on my Kindle. That's why it was on this part of this TBR scavenger hunt. I have already started it, because that's all I've got left, is that bit. Because it is so readable. It is so good. This is the story of the Trojan War, but told by the women whose stories are never usually told. So it's told from the perspective of Briseis, no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is one of the women who was captured during the Trojan War by Achilles and became Achilles' concubine. Is that what they're called? I don't know. But the woman, his mistress, his whore. It's the story of her and her life in the camp during the siege of Troy, as they were trying to get into Troy. But yes. This is the next one. I shall update you when I have finished this final 80 pages. Yay! 5 stars. We've ended on a high note. I'm so happy. Yay. So, The Silence of the Girls. I've already explained what it's about, but something I didn't want to mention before, which I did note down, is there's a quote in the very, very first chapter. And I will say, This story is gripping from the first chapter. It is brilliant. There is a quote in the first chapter. Let me get out my trusty notebook. I'd been kind to Ismene, or I thought I had, but perhaps no kindness was possible between owner and slave, only varying degrees of brutality. And this idea of slavery and the varying degrees of brutality is the theme, really, of this whole book. Like, it just unifies everything. And yeah, that is just set up in the first. I think that is such good storytelling, because it gives you something to keep thinking about as you're reading. I love that way of storytelling. I love that. There were points in this where I was thinking, I'm not sure about this, because this is supposed to be about the women. It's supposed to be their story that doesn't get told. And I was getting a bit concerned, because every now and then we have a chapter that's told from Achilles' perspective. And I was thinking, hang on a minute, this is supposed to be the women's story. Why do we keep getting the men's perspective put back in it? But actually, I think it's very clever, because there is a section in this. Looking back, it seemed to me I'd been trying to escape, not just from the camp, but from Achilles' stories. And I'd failed, because, make no mistake, this was his story, his anger, his grief, his story. I was angry, I was grieving, but somehow that didn't matter. Here I was again, waiting for Achilles to decide when it was time for bed, still trapped, still stuck inside his story, and yet with no real part to play in it. And that's the point, is this is a story that has predominantly about the men in the war. And this story keeps trying to encroach on the women's story. So it's actually really clever how the author did it, that this is still a men's story, and it's the women trying to break out of the silence of the girls. And then at the end, literally on the last page. So something else I loved about this was that we have this like mirroring of the first scene of the women trapped in the citadel, waiting basically to be taken by the men as slaves, mirroring at the end when Troy is taken and the women of Troy having the same thing happen to them, and then Briseis, in the first instance, seeing it from inside the citadel and being one of those women, to seeing it happen to other women and being completely unable to do anything about it. Suppose, just once in all these centuries, the slippery gods keep their word and Achilles is granted eternal glory in return for his early death under the walls of Troy. What will they make of us, the people of those unimaginably distant times? One thing I do know, they won't want the brutal reality of conquest and slavery. They won't want to be told about the massacres of men and boys, the enslavement of women and girls. They won't want to know we were living in a rape camp. No, they'll go for something altogether softer. A love story, perhaps. I just hope they managed to work out who the lovers were. It was brilliant. I mean, there's so much more to say about this. But right now, I've literally just finished it, made myself a coffee, put the camera on, to literally tell you this was brilliant. Amazing. 5 stars. Loved it. And I found out there's a second one as well, which is amazing. Now, before I wrap up, I did notice that there's an author's note in which she starts by thanking Claire Alexander, and Claire spelt the exact same way as a Claire that is the author of a book that I have on my shelf. Do I start the scavenger hunt again and do this all again? Maybe. Maybe I will. Anyway, what do we have? So, let's start with the good ones. My 2 5-star reads. The Restoration of Otto Laird by Nigel Packer and The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. Just brilliant. Go and read. I have also whittled down, 7 books from my TBR because of this little scavenger hunt, which is nice. Yes, we have some that I didn't really like. I wasn't a big fan of Law by Alexandra Bracken. I really didn't like Dead Poets Society. I was quite kind about it. When looking back at the footage, I was quite kind about it, but nah, not my cup of tea. It would have been a 2 stars. The only reason I gave it 3 is because I want someone to rewrite it. Helicopters. What is all the noisiness about? And then we had some that I'm a bit meh about. So we had The Testament of Gideon Mack, which I was a bit meh about. Oh, I did also really love You'll Be Safe Here. I haven't got it next to me, but I did also really love You'll Be Safe Here. So it wasn't a 5-star, but brilliant read. So yeah, I'm quite happy with that. Thanks for watching. Did you enjoy it?